camp, what year you went to camp. I'm always curious in what camp you went to. It's always really nice to see that kind of participation in the chat, and I'll make sure to take a look at it later. I will not be talking about every camp in America today, of course, but I will be curious to see where you all went, and then maybe in the questions and answers, I can get to some of the kinds of camps that you went to if I don't touch upon it in my talk. So I want to talk for about 45-ish minutes, and then I'm really looking forward to being in conversation with you. So in the late 1960s, a group of campers at Camp Hemshech, a Yiddish cultural sleepaway camp in upstate New York, took a field trip to see a local theater production of Fiddler on the Roof. At Hemshech, campers spoke Yiddish on a daily basis, immersed themselves in the literature and history of Ashkenazi Jewry, and commemorated the recent Holocaust through celebrating and emulating the Yiddish-speaking culture that thrived in the past. To one counselor named Joe, watching Fiddler that day evoked a surprising feeling. Less like watching a fictionalized depiction of the past than an expression of life at Camp Hemshech, causing the campers to feel, quote, very much like the chosen people. As the group watched the play, and more importantly, watched the rest of the audience watch the play, they felt, quote, almost as though as they were in on a very special secret. After the campers ended the night of performances by singing Yiddish songs to this audience of vacationing middle-class Jews from New York City, Joe experienced what she proclaimed an inescapable feeling of authenticity. Drawing a clear line of distinction between the audience, for whom Fiddler on the Roof reflected a nostalgic past, and the Hemshech campers and counselors, who saw themselves as active defenders of and participants in the culture on stage, Joe distinguished camp life and the kinds of Jews that campers became through it from mainstream American Jewish culture, detached from its cultural inheritance and from real Jewishness as Joe understood it. Placing Yiddishism, a 19th century Jewish linguistic nationalism, and Bundism, a Jewish form of socialism rooted in Eastern Europe, at the center of its mission, the leaders of Camp Hemshech operated on a very different political wavelength from the vast majority of American Jews at that time. By the late 1960s, not only had Yiddish ceased to be an everyday vernacular among most American Jews, most Jews had also consciously worked to disentangle themselves from the kinds of socialist and communist ideas that Hemshech promoted in response to the intense scrutiny that Jews faced under McCarthyism. In comparison to well-known summer camp networks like Camp Ramah or Young Judea or the Union of Reform Judaism's camps, Hemshech had a very small population, serving around 100 campers each year at one campsite, most of them first-generation Americans and the children of Holocaust survivors. But while Hemshech represented a marginal ideology with a shrinking audience, Joe's description of the camp's Fiddler excursion mirrored the purposes of a much wider variety of post-war Jewish summer camps, to bring children and teenagers closer to their leaders or their movement's particular visions of authentic Jewishness, conceptions that were based on those of Jews from other times and places, like pre-war Eastern Europe, or fantasies of an ideal contemporary elsewhere, like in Israel. Camp leaders' interest in simulating other times and places had much to do with how they felt about their current moment and locale, post-war America. While American Jews had been steadily climbing into middle classness prior to World War II, Jewish soldiers returning home from the war found themselves catapulted into middle class comfort, benefiting from housing loans and educational scholarships that were offered to white veterans only. As they moved from cities to suburbs, the synagogue center with its sisterhoods, men's clubs, and other social offerings provided new Jewish suburbanites official and tangible ways to affiliate with Judaism, replacing the informal neighborhood affiliations of urban communities earlier in the century. Mirroring middle-class America's mounting focus on the child during the baby boom, furthermore, children and adolescents became the center of Jewish communal priorities, coinciding with what many have described as a golden age of American Judaism, a time marked by social mobility, affluence, suburbanization, and what Herbert Gans coined child-centered Judaism, the period saw the dramatic growth of synagogue Hebrew schools, nursery schools, youth groups, and yes, summer camps. And I can tell, I know a lot of you lived through this time, so this might be all familiar, but it's good to remember this historical context before we get into the camp experience itself. So summer camps predate the post-World War II period by several decades. In the Progressive Era, Jews alongside Fresh Air Reformers, the Boy Scouts of America, settlement house organizations, and Christian congregations began to build residential summer camps for children, providing reprieve from what progressives saw as the negative impacts of urban life on immigrant children. Philanthropic Jewish camps offered recreation in nature with the comfort of socializing with one's own fellow Jews. Private camps for middle-class Jewish children, on the other hand, offered opportunities for families that were denied entry into Christian majority camps. In the 1920s, a small number of new camps built by Hebrew-oriented, Yiddish-oriented, Zionist, and other Jewish educational organizations were established, incorporating some elements of Jewish study, leadership training, and language learning. In an industry focused on recreation, immersion in nature, socialization, and Americanization, camps with intensely Jewish missions were originally on the margins of the Jewish camping sector. But this began to change in the years between the two world wars and took off primarily in the aftermath of World War II, when Jews experienced these new economic and social conditions, and along with them, new anxieties about the Jewish future. Growing affluence and rising social status clearly afforded American Jews many benefits. As they climbed the educational and professional ladder, most Jews happily embraced their new standing and the material and psychological comforts that came with it. The sizable and attractive synagogue buildings and Jewish community centers that Jews built reflected their comfort in post-war suburbia and their plans to stay there for the long haul. At the same time, these dramatic socioeconomic transitions also provoked deep anxieties among communal leaders. Many Jews felt intensely ambivalent about their socioeconomic ascent, worrying that Jewish cultural authenticity would not survive the comfort of suburbia. And they, rather than celebrating a new place in American society, educators, rabbis, and lay leaders projected these concerns onto youth and parents in particular, citing a growing need to develop Jewish identity in children. Having never experienced for themselves life in Jewish urban ghettos, let alone life in Eastern European shtetl, mythologized and nostalgized as they were, a diverse onslaught of American Jews worried that the younger generation would never come to understand real Jewishness on their own. Without intervention, they argued, quote unquote, authentic Jewish culture would disappear altogether. The full realizations of the Holocaust devastation added a level of urgency to their distress about the state of post-war Jewishness. Without European Jewry to look to, and with Israel's future at that point very uncertain, post-war American Jewish leaders saw themselves as responsible for carrying Judaism and Jewish culture forward into the future. For many Jewish educators, producing educational, immersive, and affective Jewish camp experiences in the Holocaust's aftermath was a matter of cultural life or death, of continuity or discontinuity. Ironically, the affluence at the heart of their concerns about authenticity proved essential in the Jewish camping sector's ability to flourish. In the early 20th century, thousands of Jewish children attended philanthropic camps that served immigrants and the children of immigrants, or smaller private Jewish camps for the middle and upper class Jewish elite. But post-war Jews had more resources to put towards their camps, their children's education and recreation, and also the parents' enjoyment of their own child-free summers. The more that families could afford to send children to camp, the more that the yearly migration of young Jews from Jewish urban neighborhoods to the and suburbs to the American countryside became a distinguishing element of Jewish middle classness, and for thousands of young Jews, a rite of passage. This sunny economic picture also meant that Jewish movements and institutions had the ability to purchase acres of land where they built modern, comfortable, and permanent campsites and could provide scholarships for families who cannot afford camp without assistance. The Jewish summer camp thusly offers a unique lens between examining the tensions between the post-war period's goldenness and its ambivalence. Rather than sitting in contradiction, the affluence, comfort, and social mobility and the anxiety over cultural decline that Jews experienced really fed off of each other, pushing Jewish culture and communal life into new directions. The educational or ideological Jewish summer camp was one such direction, and the dazzling homogeneity of camp structures and methods over the course of the post-war period really reveals their leaders' underlying shared hopes and dreams, that camps could counteract the downsides of the present, propelling positive, real, or authentic Jewishness into the future. So today I will be bringing those adult visions of Jewishness to the fore by looking at how leaders organized various aspects of everyday life within Jewish camps. And yet the story of Jewish camping, like most history in general, has mainly been told through the eyes of ideologues, communal leaders, educators, rabbis, mostly male and mostly middle-aged, who constructed and directed camps with their dreams of molding the next generation of young Jews. So here in this image, we have Leibish Lehrer, the gentleman kind of in the center of this horseshoe shaped of campers, talking to campers, bringing forth his vision. This is a Sabbath lineup, a Shabbos lineup. Really should say Shabbos and not Shabbat because this was a Yiddish oriented camp, a Shabbos lineup. And this is him bringing his, his ideas of what Shabbos should be to the campers. But this is only one perspective, the way that Leibish Lehrer projected his concerns, anxieties, desires onto campers, right? We mostly look at education this way, the leader or the teacher and the class kind of in front of him or her. But this is really odd because actually adults ultimately constituted the minority of camps populations, also schools populations, right? And their missions and plans really only represent one side of a more nuanced story. Indeed, all summer camps blossom through intergenerational negotiation, permissiveness, and attention to children and teenagers' peer culture. Jewish children and teenagers arrived at camp seeking fun, freedom, play, escape, romance, and generally prioritized these elements over their camp's ideological or educational missions. Leaders formulated their missions in advance of the summer, but life at camp proved much more complicated. To make a mark on campers, staff had to get their buy-in, answering to their needs, desires, and interests. Camp's abilities to succeed educationally and economically fundamentally required campers to believe in their missions. Children and teens, therefore, wielded a tremendous amount of power within the camp environment. In their everyday reactions, their decisions to engage or disengage, to nod in agreement or to roll an eye in defiance. And I know a lot of you probably are parents, so you know what I mean, right, about the rolling of an eye. So looking at the top down and the bottom up, today I really want to highlight how dynamics between adult and youth, child and teen, staff and camper, not only shaped the texture of everyday life within summer camps, but reconstituted American Jewish culture in and outside of them with several lasting implications. Second. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about what camps I focus on in this project. Because as I mentioned before, I hope you added into the chat where you went to camp. I couldn't study all Jewish camps, so I really had to focus in on a particular set of them, and also which camps had really robust archives versus no archives at all in many cases. So I found that camps affiliated with Zionist movements, Yiddish cultural organizations and institutions, and the conservative and reform movements of Judaism, all of which began in the Northeast, but spread to the Midwest, the South, and eventually the West Coast as well, were by far the most emblematic of the post-war trends I've discussed so far. So Zionist camps aim to mold Jewish American youth into at least supporters of, if not future citizens of Israel. Some were socialist, others were more centrist or mainstream, and others more right-wing. Yiddishist camps, and I think that's the one that needs more defining, at least for most of my audiences, focus their efforts on defending and spreading the Yiddish language, promoting what they called broadly Yiddish culture, including Yiddish literature, theater, and music. They also often touted socialism and communism and kind of linked their Yiddishism to kinds of socialism, communism, or in the case of Hemshech, the Bundism that came from Eastern Europe. Jewish denominational camps, those founded and ran by the Reform and conservative movements, promoted the religious and cultural ideals of those movements, shaping their programs to mold campers into future communal or religious leaders. I should note that a larger and more defined Orthodox camping sector emerged only in earnest in the 1960s as modern Orthodoxy, as we kind of know it today, began to grow in size and self-assuredness and definition as a community, and also began its more delayed transition into affluence and suburbia. And so while some Orthodox camps did receive attention in my book, they're mostly divergent from the timeline of the more liberal and secular elements of the Jewish community and sets them slightly apart. So these four camp types did not encapsulate all of the Jewish camps of the period. Dozens of camps sponsored by the Young Men's Hebrew Association or Jewish community centers that were perhaps mostly recreational but incorporated some cultural and religious practices throughout the era. There were also private summer camps owned by Jewish families. This was especially true in the South and also in some cases in the Midwest, where communal camps and private camps arrived before the sort of larger camping movement's outposts. But the amount of Jewish education that communal camps integrated into their programs really varied intensely from site to site, director to director, and even year to year. From the 40s to the 60s, it was these four kinds of camps that really stood out in the degree to which religious, political, and linguistic ideologies shaped the details of everyday camp life and how much energy their leaders invested in inculcating youth with Jewish beliefs, practices, cultural touchstones, and political attitudes. So these camps had different ideologies, to be sure, but what's interesting about looking at them together, and of course I could have written 4 separate books about each of these kinds of camps, right? The thing about looking at them together is the fact that they use extremely similar methods of producing what they considered to be ideal or authentic Jewishness within their camps. For camp leaders, Jewish authenticity was inherently located elsewhere, in other historical periods or other cultures. So take, for instance, my friend Leibush Lehrer, again, from earlier. Lehrer was a prominent leader in Yiddish education who founded and directed Camp Boybrik for the purpose of educating the students of the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute, which was a Yiddish folk shul or day school in New York during the summer months. I'll also note that his last name, Lehrer, means teacher or educator, which is always really like kind of a lovely fact for those who do speak Yiddish. So in a 1959 essay, Lehrer explained, "Those who have ever been under the sway of authentic Jewish tradition must have felt the disparity of some basic elements of Jewish and American culture, a disparity which has led to interminable conflicts between the older and younger generations." Rabbi David Maligner, an important Ramah leader, echoed similar ideas in the late 60s in a text regarding Jewish education at Ramah. He believed that camps, at their best, should, quote, serve American Jewry by providing creative, imaginative, and positive programs, which will strengthen American Jewish life here and assure its continuity under optimum conditions. While each camp, in other words, had its own ideologically imbued vision of authenticity, Ramah used more like Israel and religious Judaism, and Lehrer used Yiddish culture and secularism as his guide, these leaders shared a core belief that authentic Jewishness would not naturally occur in the American environment. Rather, it had to be fabricated or produced. And they believed that sleepaway camps would prove ideal atmospheres for its production due to their immersive 24/7 quality. So becoming authentic meant transforming into a Jew from another time or another place. And educators structured their camps as simulations of the perceived lifestyles of Zionist pioneers and soldiers, Warsaw Ghetto resistance fighters, Yiddish-speaking socialists and writers, Maccabees going further back in history, and other heroes of Jewish history accordingly, all untainted by comfortable, affluent American suburbia. This fantasy, this idea that camps had unparalleled power to mold children, deeply informed the structure of camps programs, including at their most basic level, their schedules and their environments. So let's talk about schedules for a second. At their most basic level, leaders organized time at camp to simulate the lifestyles of Jews from other times and places. Through the content and overall flow of camp's daily, weekly, and monthly schedules, leaders projected and enacted their fantasies onto campers, inflecting every hour and also the entire every day of the week, with the Sabbath at its end, with their specific visions of ideal Jewishness. So here's an example, actually from camp I went to, but way before I was born, from Camp Tel Yehuda. Here's a real, beginning of the day schedule that I found in the archives. You have a lot of different activities. Boker Tov, just good morning, that's wake up time. This is a typo, it should say Haramat HaDegel, flag raising. So, even what flags the camp raised in the morning said a lot about their ideologies. Did they raise an American flag and an Israeli flag? Did they skip the Israeli flag? Did they raise the state flag? It could tell you a lot about the ideologies or the kind of identities of a camp. In this case, young Judea camps had tefillot, praying, but not all Zionist camps did. Many were secular. And the other thing that should be noticed about the schedule, I'm sure you're already noticing, is that there's very little English on it. There's transliteration, but it's mostly Hebrew terminology. And this is also a huge feature of camp that we're going to talk about today, the use of language of Hebrew and Yiddish. Just to zoom out for a second from TY and look at kind of a wider array of how it worked at different camps, what I created here, and it's also in the book, is an amalgamation of different camps' daily schedules. So I put here in the parentheses the names in Hebrew and Yiddish. And so it's really interesting to see that although a Yiddish-oriented camp and a Hebrew-oriented camp would use these different languages, a lot of the orders of their schedules were the same. And also that really at every hour, nearly every hour of camp, there was a way to insert the camp's ideologies, right? So we kind of talked about flag raising, even cleaning up could be linked to a camp's ideologies. Is it a socialist camp? Well, then they might, use the camp socialism to encourage campers to feel that nikayon or upveinikin, a cleaning up period, is part of their camp community, not just something that has to be done, but something that has a sort of ideology to it. All of the camps I studied had an educational activity, a pulat chinuch or a Lern show, a Yiddish show, where they would really insert the camp's ideological framework and vision really most directly through usually informal or experiential education, but sometimes frontal education as well. A lot of these camps had an hour of work, of avodah or arbit. And then in the afternoon, you kind of have a rotation of sports, arts and crafts activities, and different things. And even again, in something like sports, ideology could be included. There's this camp game called Gaga, and no one really knows if it's Israeli, but the notion that Gaga is an Israeli sport is so embedded in Jewish summer camps that it almost doesn't matter where its true roots are, because it's the idea of playing a game that came from Israel. So all of these different aspects, even the evening activities and things, could be infused with ideologies. So one of the arts activities was dance. A lot of the Jewish summer camps included Israeli folk dancing, other kinds of Jewish folk dancing into their activities by day and also at night. Here's one picture from Camp Sedgwin of their dance festival. A lot of camps would put on dance festivals and have campers split into groups and put on Israeli folk dances. Here's an example from work. And again, really interesting to see. This comes from Camp Hemshech. I know this because I found it, but also because in the background, we can see backwards that it says Haverschaft on that sign. Haverschaft is the camp's motto. It means like camaraderie or friendship. It really means friendship in kind of modern use of Yiddish, but in this case, it could be kind of thought of as like a socialist camaraderie. But I have very similar pictures from Camp Ramah or Young Judea, other kinds of Zionist camps, which shows that while they touted in some ways opposing ideologies, they also really were very, very linked and had similarities between them. I mentioned before language. So space and environment was one way that camps could create a sort of tangible experience in the ideology or the kind of framework of the educational framework of camp. And one way they did that was through using Hebrew or Yiddish respectively to name places around camp. So here's Camp Hemshech's new campsite plan from sometime in the 1960s. All of the buildings had names in Yiddish. And this was also true in Zionist and many Jewish camps where that would be the case in Hebrew. It's also, space is also, it can really tell us a lot about what a camp prioritized and what was part of everyday life. So here's a picture from a reform camp. I believe this is Osrui. And they have this really beautiful dedicated prayer space with an ark for the Torah, but you wouldn't find this at Camp Hemshech or many of the socialist Zionist camps. So this already, this image tells me something about how they organize time and what they prioritize. Building a beautiful space for prayer, for davening is kind of a vision, a way of them promulgating their vision. Another thing you can find is a lot of pictures of children living in tents or staying in tents for periods of time, and that is drawing on Zionist ideology. So a lot of programs in the post-war decades would try to mimic the experience of moving to Israel, of making aliyah, and living, maybe in a kibbutz. Even if that wasn't the case for most olim, for most people who made aliyah in that period, they still sort of promoted this idea that at camp you could prepare for a life in Israel, and you would do so in a tent. Another place you see the ideologies of camps really come out is in various forms of play or role play. So progressive educational philosophies always underpinned the educational summer camp enterprise, with camp leaders arguing that play and recreation proved vital to social development and education. Jewish educators of the early 20th century adopted these ideas too, aided by the heavily Jewish professions of social work and social science. That would also be interesting. I'd be curious if there are any social workers or social scientists in the crowd, because that was such a common, Jewish trade in the post-war years. So, but the games that campers play took on new forms and purposes in the post-war decades. Through role-playing games and what many social workers called sociodrama, various forms of play at camp worked to make the simulation of Jewish lifestyles that were apparent in all of the ways I've talked about in the daily schedules and the environments, all the more direct. Orchestrated and curated by directors and educators influenced by Jewish social science, campers took on the roles of historical and contemporary Jews from other parts of the world through imaginative and performative play. So here's one example from the Hebraeus summer camp, Camp Masad, and I'm gonna guess I have the Camp Masad someone in here because it was a very common, very popular camp in this period. And this seems like it's probably a stage play, but a good example of some sort of vision of life in Palestine or Israel. They have these fake guns, which is sort of interesting, probably not something you would see at a camp today for a whole variety of reasons. Here from Camp Hemshech, I find these photos, I don't exactly know what's going on. If we had more time, I would have you tell me what you think is going on, but I think this is really interesting. I found tons of pictures of these, 1960s teenagers who are secular. This is a camp that celebrates Jewish secularism, and yet they're dressed up as Orthodox, Hasidic seeming Jews, shtetl Jews, perhaps. This camper clearly kind of stuffed a pillow under her dress to seem pregnant. And so part of camp life is role playing or simulating or putting on plays about Jewish life elsewhere. Here's another picture from Camp Hemshech that I absolutely love, of campers quite clearly dressed as tailors. But again, the camper in the middle, he's wearing something that's supposed to look like tzitzit. And so you see that even though it's the secular camp, they look towards Jews of the past with a certain kind of reverence and a certain kind of desire to be more like them. This also applied to color war, or what a lot of camps called Maccabiyah, which, while recreational, drew inspiration from the ideologies of camps. So this is a Camp Sedgwin photograph. And here's one from Hemshech. So a lot of times the camps would break kids into these color war groups, according to colors, red, green, blue, yellow, let's say, but they would also apply their ideologies to the team names and what the teams represented. So in this camp, this is a Yud Lamed Peretz, one of the great writers of Yiddish of the 20th century. Yud Lamed Peretz team. There was also a Mendele Mocher Sforim team, Shalom Aleichem team, I think there was a Bashevis Singer team. And you'd see this at Zionist camps as well, teams that were broken up into different regions of Israel, for instance, or other kinds of things like that. And this wasn't an everyday thing, but something that happened once a summer was Tisha B'Av or some kind of other day for secular camps where they would mark the recent Holocaust. So Tisha B'Av is the only Jewish holy day to fall during the summer months, and it was the main moment for marking the Holocaust alongside a host of other Jewish tragedies. And avowedly secular Yiddish camps like Hemshech created alternatives to it. Camp Hemshech called it Ghetto Day. And at all these different camps, their differing political and religious standpoints really infused the days with different messages and goals. But their camp-wide programs also proved remarkably similar in tone and in order. All different kinds of camps used stories of Jewish heroism as counterbalances for the sadness of the day, drawing inspiration from Warsaw Ghetto resistance fighters, Israeli soldiers, or both, depending on their ideological orientations. Addressing the Holocaust, educators believed, functioned as a particularly powerful tool in their efforts to change Jewish culture through the next generation. Not only because it offered a chance to underscore the relevance of their camp's nationalist, religious, and linguistic ideologies, but because campers sourced deep commitments to their Jewishness through stories of Jewish suffering. And a lot of times camps would mention in the archives that campers behaved better after Tisha B'Av and Ghetto Day because they understood that they attended things more often. They didn't skip activities. They listened more during educational activities because at least temporarily they were reminded of the importance of kind of the continuity of culture that the camps were trying to do. This, I'll just make a little side note. This mosaic on top and this sort of, this is a memorial that they built at Camp Hemshech was actually built by Daniel Libeskind, the very famous architect of Holocaust memorials all around the world. He was a camper and counselor at Hemshech, and I interviewed him, and he had completely forgotten about this. Other campers remembered that he was the art director that year, that he had done this. He had forgotten this, but then when he saw the picture, he said, wow, that was my first Holocaust memorial, which is pretty amazing. You know, the most famous creator of Holocaust memorials in the world made his first one in upstate New York at Camp Hemshech. And I want to go back to language for a second. So, you know, I think most of you probably know that for most of Jewish history, Jews were multilingual and they spoke the languages of the places they lived in, as well as Jewish languages like Yiddish or Ladino. Post-war American Jews, however, were overwhelmingly monolingual and had quickly, you know, embraced English as their lingua franca their parents had. So as camps tried to turn the tides of what they saw as a decline in Jewish authenticity, they really came to see Jewish languages as paramount in their efforts. And they saw the abandonment of Yiddish or lack of interest in spoken and written Hebrew as indications of just how far Jewish culture had fallen. And so integrating Hebrew and Yiddish into camp life from the 40s onward, they really hoped to not only connect campers to their Ashkenazi roots or to Hebrew culture, the Hebrew culture of the nascent state of Israel, but to really transform them into the Jews they envisioned as more ideal or more authentic. So this is an image from Camp Masad. Masad was really the closest that a long-standing Jewish camp was to having a Hebrew-speaking environment. And this kind of picture behind, I guess that's home plate. I haven't been to a baseball game in a long time. My husband's at a Yankees game right now. I think that must be home plate because that's where they start, right? That shows that they were trying to get campers to even use Hebrew during baseball, the most American game there is, right? So they had to create terms in Hebrew to make that possible. And they're very, very funny terms for Hebrew speakers often. They also did language immersion through having little phrase books or dictionaries around camp, you know, at the dining table or in the bunk. Some camps even had homework or worksheets they would do during Yiddish or Hebrew hour. So here's one from Camp Hemshech that shows, you know, the teaching campers how to conjugate verbs. And I think there's another one, maybe it's not here, where they talk about how to use the article die, der, or das, the gendered articles. And a lot of times they would also teach Hebrew and encourage Hebraism, the ideology around Hebrew, through making campers translate American pop hits or, you know, Broadway musicals into Hebrew. So at Camp Ramah, all of the musicals, I think still through today, are translated into Hebrew. So eventually they would, you know, they would do things like even Hair and Jesus Christ Superstar, as absurd that is, apparently happened in Hebrew at Camp Ramah. And here's an example of a Beatles song, Maxwell's Silver Hammer, translated into Hebrew, because at at Mossad, where this came from, they weren't really allowed to enjoy American pop music. So they had to kind of translate into Hebrew if they wanted to do it. So the thing is that the fantasy of the Hebrew or Yiddish speaking camp really clashed with linguistic realities. And campers often had a kind of lack of enthusiasm about the idea of speaking Hebrew or Yiddish full time. And this was an issue of substantial hand-wringing and intergenerational tension that really showed the power that children had to change camp programs and American Jewish life in return. So most camps that tried to be fully Hebrew or Yiddish speaking, they had to abandon those plans and become more what my friend and colleague Sarah Benor would call infused with Hebrew or Yiddish, not immersive Hebrew or Yiddish. And that really relates to the thing I talked about before, the idea of looking at camp from the perspective of campers and thinking about intergenerational tension and the ways that campers actually held tremendous power in the camp environment. So camp leaders incorporated various forms of democratic education into their camp schedule, conceiving of their camps as children's republics, like little miniature democracies. This vision of camping was not unique to Jewish institutions, nor was it an invention of the post-war decades. In fact, American summer camping's leaders, Jewish and Christian alike, enthusiastically adopted this point of view at the turn of the century, inspired by educational philosophers like John Dewey. But while post-war Jewish camps continued this tradition, many also reframed their purposes in doing so, emphasizing how democracy could fit into their broader visions of passing Jewish authenticity on to children. Zionist and Yiddish-focused summer camps, both those that existed pre-war as well as new ones built in the immediate post-war decade, came to stress the democratic practices of Zionist movements, the kibbutz, Yiddish-speaking socialists, and the state of Israel as examples of how Jews from other times and places also carried the banner of democracy. Reform and conservative camps reflected their parents' movement's broader valuing of democracy. They depicted democracy as an inherently Jewish way to organize, and they also matched it to their movement's historical embraces of America and Americanism and American democracy. So far I've really talked about this top-down dynamic. Staff have an idea based on an ideology, they implement said idea, and campers sort of do what they say. But as I mentioned before, life at camp actually occurred with a much more dynamic situation, a much more nuanced situation. Camp leaders embraced democracy because they saw the benefits in involving youth in the implementation of their own transformation. So they adapted this model of democracy to address the desires of campers for greater freedom and rights within the summer camp. And so democratic education shifted, especially in the 60s, as American youth more broadly protested, walked out, and led social change movements. Youth at Jewish camps increasingly sought to expand their rights at camp and contribute to, if not alter, their camp's political, religious, and ideological landscapes. Through camper councils and assemblies in which elected representatives or the entire camper body took on the task of representing their interests to staff, educators aimed to bring campers into the decision-making of everyday life. And they even let them debate camp's core ideologies such as language, nationalism, and the Sabbath. Camp newspapers became central organisms of camp democratic experiments, allowing campers to praise, parody, and critique their camps. But much like student governments in American schools, these various forms of democracy did not really allow children to flip pyramids of power or change the underlying ideologies of their camps. So here's a good example. This came from Camp Swig, actually, which is a California Reformed Jewish camp. This was a great piece to find because basically it talks about how there was this moment where campers really realized that they don't have full ability, they don't have full freedom at camp. There are these rules that still dictate what they can and cannot do. And so in reaction to finding out that they are actually not able to change the rules about swearing at camps to allow them to swear on the Sabbath as a kind of part of their Sabbath enjoyment to be able to curse, they say, well, that's nice for camp rules, but if this is a government of their own, there's no such thing as abiding to camp rules. So is this what you call freedom? Is this what you call being free? So obviously this is a kind of fake form of freedom, right? And yet in response to camper behaviors, educators believe that even giving the illusion of democracy helped alleviate problems caused by the power imbalance between campers and staff. Through bringing campers into the running of camp, allowing them to complain and even stage protests, and associating camp life with freedom, allowance, and fun, camp leaders hoped that their campers would come away feeling that they had transformed into authentic Jews, their camps encouraged by their own volition. And so while a camp's influence on youth has to do with many parts of daily life, this distinctive incorporation of leniency, freedom, and recreation with ideology and control laid at the core of camp's powers, leading youth to believe that their camp's cultural, political, and religious values were one and the same of their own. I'm noting that I'm running a little short on time, so I'm going to talk about this a little bit more briefly. But this came really to the fore when we think about sex, romance, and different parts of dating culture at camps. So in this realization that camp leaders had that allowing a certain degree of laxity or structured mayhem, as one scholar calls it, would create an environment of camper buy-in, there's really no area of camp life that they leaned into this idea more than in the realm of camper dating and romance and sexuality. Much like in American culture writ large, going steady, developing crushes, making out, all encompassed central aspects of Jewish camper culture in the 50s. And the frequency of references to romance and sexuality at camp increased throughout the 60s and 70s. Camp newspapers written by campers and supervised by staff provided a crucial window into camper culture surrounding romance. News reports on camp socials, such as a 1963 report on a dance at Camp Hemshech, which a camper praised for the candlelight, which added a romantic touch and helped set the mood for the evening, ran alongside advice columns like these, modeled after Dear Abby, which allowed campers to address their interest in the opposite sex through humor and also anonymity. Internal documents of head staff rarely included descriptions of or responses to camp's romantic and sexual cultures. But in the 1960s at Ramah, Wisconsin, head staff members did have an ongoing discussion throughout their yearly reports over how much freedom campers should have at night and at what ages during the last period of the daily schedule they should be allowed to kind of go off with their boyfriends or girlfriends. And it really displayed how they aimed to strike a balance between what campers wanted and what they believed the boundaries of age-appropriate behavior could be. Romance and sexuality encompassed the main aspect of Jewish youth's desires and interests within the world of the camp, and became a more public part of camp life in the same years the broader sexual revolution took place. Rather than placing more limits on campers' behaviors with the opposite sex, however, most camp leaders saw a purpose in providing campers time for romantic and quote-unquote age-appropriate forms of sexual contact. So this also changed again as concerns over rising intermarriage in the late 60s and 70s took hold within the ranks of Jewish institutions. Camp leaders came to see a role in supporting and fostering opportunities for camp romance in their efforts of molding new generations of youth as a method of infusing Jewish youth with an appreciation for marrying within the faith. So a couple concluding thoughts. Fearful of decline and mournful in the wake of the Holocaust, post-war Jews grappled with questions surrounding the Jewish future within the world of the summer camp, creating new and reconstituting old modes of being Jewish for the second half of the 20th century. Through daily activities, play, mourning the Holocaust, speaking Hebrew and Yiddish, and inculcating camp life with democracy, educators taught campers ways of being Jewish through having them live Jewishly. But achieving their fantasies of saving Jewish culture from decline required the energy and inspiration of the next generation in order to find success. As the generations negotiated the purposes and textures of camp life, both indirectly and directly, these camps changed older ideologies and modes for their historical moments. So, in the case of Zionism, the ideologies educators hoped to pass on never led to mass immigration to Israel, although some campers did move to Israel as adults, nor did it make kids, broadly speaking, fluent in Hebrew. However, it did turn Zionism into a tool for finding a Jewish identity in a moment of multiculturalism, providing a yardstick of authenticity for American kids to measure themselves up against. So I take this image here from Birthright to kind of show that that's one of the legacies of the way that camps use Zionism. Now it's easier, it's been easier for decades to bring young Jews to Israel. It's cheaper, airfare had become much more affordable by the time Birthright began in the late 90s, early 2000s. But camps really began this trend way, way further back of using Israel as an identity tool. Yiddishist camps did not succeed in saving the Yiddish language per se, but they did create a new form of Yiddishism for the post-war moment, which, much like Zionism, became primarily about sourcing Jewish identity. While Yiddish camps like Hemshech and Leibishler's Boybrick did not survive, they both closed around 1980, they undoubtedly succeeded by a different and very overlooked metric, perpetuating Yiddish cultural and linguistic activism and carrying the torch of a kind of diasporism that's actually gaining traction among American Jewish young people today, in many ways responding to Israel's rightward shift. So these two images I took as sorts of examples. Here we have a Bernie Sanders campaign poster that someone who speaks Yiddish or likes Yiddish created. It says, Bernie kommt für uns, Lomer kämpfen für Bernie. Bernie fights for us, let's fight for Bernie. And then on the other side, Mir wollen sie überleben, which is a Yiddish song from Eastern Europe that's been taken on by leftist activists and Jews that embrace the diaspora in their different kind of political activism. And in both the conservative and reform camps, the youthful ethos of the long 60s impacted the way Judaism was practiced in deep ways, making it in both cases more traditional in a certain way, more Hebrew oriented, but also helping their movements become more egalitarian when it came to feminism. These camps also embraced Zionism over time, indicating how its use as an American Jewish identity tool expanded well beyond Zionist movements. So I think I'm gonna, let's see, yeah, okay. So last concluding thoughts, at every public and scholarly lecture I've given, I've been asked something along the lines of if Jewish summer camps work. Indeed, the consensus among various communal stakeholders today is that Jewish camps largely succeeded in their goals of transforming young Jews. Studies of camps' impact have backed up this assertion since the 70s with data that display lower rates of intermarriage, higher rates of membership in Jewish organizations and synagogues, and more support for or attachment to Israel. Post-war educators, journalists, and camp staff similarly lauded the perceived impacts of camp on youth, marveling at how quote-unquote gloriously motivated Jewish children became after the summer as they experienced Jewishness at camp. They too would have just as most studies have framed the impact of camping on children as something that happens from the top down, most post-war leaders initially underestimated the power of youth in the camp environment. As the youth activist ethos of the 60s spread to camps, it became clear to adult leaders that their program's transformative properties actually relied on nuanced dynamics between themselves and the children and adolescents in their care. And so what I want to say is that while research into the influences of Jewish education can certainly be worthwhile, and we can talk about if camps are successful, I think that it's important to actually focus on how this idea, this notion that camps should be successful, should be able to transform children, repair American Jewish culture, stem assimilation, curb intermarriage, and build up support for Israel, came to shape the experience of going to camp in the first place. I think that thinking about summer camps today, it could be easy to sink into a comfortable nostalgia for simpler summers past, a time when Jews seemed to align at least on the problems that plagued them most. But my hope is that this talk and also my book more broadly will encourage people to really contemplate the ideological weights we place on children as adults and the roles that young people play in the making of Jewish culture. So that's where I'll end for now, and I'm really excited to hear your questions and finally read through the chat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fox. Maybe if you can stop share, we can have full screen, and there are many questions, so you can scroll through the chat. A lot of different camps came up there, but I do want to start with one of the questions. You mentioned that the major goals of the earlier camps, or the core ideologies, were language, nationalism, and Shabbat. And I was wondering if you can say a little about what are the core goals now. How did these ideologies shift, and what are now the main things that are being taught?
Sorry, that was a little confusing. Shabbat would not be an ideology. I was talking about things they allowed campers to debate, so they would debate about like, how do we celebrate, Mark Shabbat at camp? How Shomer Shabbat should we be, that kind of thing. The main features of the ideologies of the camps in the post-war period were definitely, like you said, like language-based, so linguistic ideologies like Yiddishism and Hebraism, which are related to nationalism, right? Related to Zionism, related to aspects of Yiddishism that were in certain ways culturally nationalist. They were political, broadly speaking, so that could be socialist, communist, Zionist of various different kinds. And they were religious in different ways. So you asked, what are they now? I think they still break down in a lot of ways to these kinds of categories, but I would say they're a little bit less overtly political than they were. So I think that camps are still very, very political, but a lot of them try to kind of toe a more centrist line. And that has partly to do with the fact that now in the present, Zionism, for instance, is sort of a given in Jewish education. There's pushback now from young Jews, and we could get to that, but that's been a given for a while. Whereas in the post-war decades, people were still grappling with what the role of Israel is going to be in American Jewish life and how central it should be to Jewish identity. And Yiddish was still a bigger feature of Jewish culture at the time. So that's an example of the change. I also think that camps have changed because the Jewish movements have changed. So a lot of camps that I studied were pretty pluralistic religiously. They had campers that came from all different kinds of backgrounds. The creation of the conservative movements camps and the reform movement camps kind of created more of a streamline where people went to the camps that were affiliated with their synagogues back at home. And also you have the growth of modern Orthodoxy in the 60s and beyond that creates a whole new camp sector. So it's hard to answer that. There's been a ton of change actually, even as a lot of aspects of daily life look very similar.
So maybe if we can zoom in a little, because there were a few questions about that, about the Israel education or programs that are, how did they shift with time? How do camps do that today and how it changed from the past?
I think camps are figuring it out. I mean, I would love to be at a camp this summer and see how are they dealing with the current crisis in Israel. How do they talk to campers about that? In the aftermath of the 6-Day War in particular, as American Jews became pretty much, that was mainstream to at least be Zionist to some effect or have some sort of affiliation or love towards Israel. We're in a different time now. We're in a really challenging time between America and Israel. We've been in a challenging time around, issues of religion like the Western Wall, and there's been challenges for a very long time. But now I think we're at a fever pitch. And so I think the answer is that camps don't know really what to do, because there's a feeling among a lot of Jewish educators that talking about Israel in a nuanced way is very hard with young children, which I can understand. Young children, they're not really getting the political Israel anyway. Their Zionism at camp is like, here's a map of Israel and here's some Hebrew words. But teenagers, there's a lot of debate about what they should be exposed to politically and what they shouldn't be, what they can handle. But teenagers are very savvy and they have the internet. And so it doesn't really work to kind of keep them in the dark about some of the things that Israel does that are less praiseworthy, I'll say, to kind of toe a certain line here. So the answer is they're still figuring it out. And it's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. A couple of years ago, there were camp alumni in their teens and 20s who started to push camps to kind of think about rethinking the role of Zionism, both kind of political Zionism and also the focus on Israel as a culturally, like, Israeli songs, Israeli dance, like what about other parts of diaspora Jewish culture? And back then, camps were very not interested in dealing with these questions. Many cases pushed these former campers away in ways that was very contentious. And now I think that the situation in Israel is changing what happens, what's going to happen and what camp leaders have to grapple with, even without camper pushback necessarily. So it's a moving target, I would say.
Now or in the last decade or more, there are a lot of Israeli counselors that are coming to summer camps. Was that something that happened in the earlier days? Were there people coming from Israel to be part of the the counselor group or other parts of it?
In Zionist camps, yes, sometimes, but very few. I mean, you'd have one or two Israelis at camp, and that was a big deal. I mean, because think about the cost of airfare, just it's very, very different. That started to grow in the 60s and 70s, where there's like there was a push to create a sort of organized program of getting Israelis to camp. I still think that was mostly in Zionist camps, but it expanded eventually to camps. So someone wrote, we always had Israeli counselors at Ramah starting in the 50s. So that doesn't really surprise me that Ramah would have them as well. Camps that were oriented towards Hebrew needed to have Hebrew speakers. But I don't know, as of when I last worked at a Zionist summer camp, which was more than 10 years ago, long time ago, half the staff was Israeli. That wasn't the case in the post-war decades. So, yeah.
Can you say a few more words about the gender shift within camp and how it affected Jewish life or American Jewry outside of camp world?
What do you mean by gender shift? Can you explain?
Yes, because you mentioned about it being more egalitarian in Jewish times, and that had an effect. So if you can say a few more words about that.
Yeah, actually, in the conservative movement, things that were happening at Ramah, maybe people who were there can write in the chat about this, were more progressive when it came to feminism, to young Jewish women being a part of leading camp services, for instance, maybe wearing a talit. That stuff happened at camp actually earlier than it did in the synagogue. And it was really interesting to find sources from rabbis that said, is Ramah actually creating a better leadership for us? Or are they taking people away from our synagogues by by actually critiquing what was going on in the suburban synagogue? So it's a very, very interesting feature of conservative camps. And I think that was just, a little bit less true in the reform camps, because the reform movement was more progressive from the get-go in that period. But still, there was a certain degree of religious experimentation that camp life allowed with kids that then eventually trickled into the movements. Definitely the Chavurah movement of the 60s, which was these independent prayer groups that sprung up in cities like Boston and New York and other places. Those were filled with alumni of Camp Ramah and other Jewish camps who wanted to take the kind of davening experiences they had at camp, the kind of prayer experiences they had at camp, and bring them into the places they lived in, including the egalitarianism. Yeah.
Maybe our last question for tonight. Can you say if Jewish summer camps are more popular now, less popular now, and if you know what are the most attended ones you have?
I really don't know. That's I'm a historian. I don't get too much into the present stuff, I have to say. I think that what they do have now, which is different than in the time I studied, is a lot more institutional support and kind of overarching organizations that take care of them. So that strengthens them and it gets the word out to more families than perhaps in the past. But I would say, if anything, they're facing a lot of challenges as well. The college admissions issue is a big one. Campers, Jewish camps have been unique in how long they keep campers. Secular camps, Christian camps, they don't usually keep campers as campers into their teens, but Jewish educational camps did that because they understood that it was really important to influence teens who were much more closer to their adulthood. And that's challenging now because campers, teenagers have a lot pulling at them in terms of what they're supposed to be achieving in the summer. So camps are working on how to stay relevant, but that's a challenge they face. So it's hard to say if they're doing better now or worse now. They're just changing all the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk and obviously also it took many people down memory lane. So it was beautiful to see the chat. We'll be sending a follow-up email with the recording and a lot of links to things that were mentioned. And I do want to mention again, your book will obviously also send a link to that. The book is called Jews of Summer Camp and Jewish Culture in Postwar America. You'll all receive a link to that and much more.
Can I make a little plug about the book?
Yes.
I'm trying to use my book as a way to support independent bookstores. So if you have an independent bookstore near you, talk to them about carrying the book or at least ordering it for you. And actually, I have a discount code that independent bookstores can use to order the book at a lower cost because indie bookstores need to be able to make money on these books. So I'm putting that code in the chat. And if you have any questions about how to get it from an independent seller instead of Amazon, let me know. It's sold in a bunch of places in Brooklyn, which you can see on my website if you happen to live in New York.
Perfect. So thank you so much for that. We'll also make sure when I send the links, I'll make sure to send not an Amazon link, but a small bookstore link, and I'll include the code and a few words about that. So thank you so much. Thank you for this talk. Everyone have a lovely week, rest of your day, evening, or night. And we're looking forward to seeing you in more of our programs. Everyone.